Can you hear me? I'm not the guy from the Verizon commercial, but I hope you can hear me. Well, thanks for coming to this session this afternoon, right after lunch. I have to tell you, despite the title and this room and the sessions, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an engineer by heart, and been in the security industry for about 15 years, mostly on the research and development side from a product and product development perspective. Been in the past 5-7 years in the antivirus and vulnerability management space, companies of names like McAfee, where I've been there for about 5 years, running antivirus development, and for the past 3 years, been at Qualys, focusing on vulnerability management space. The subject of the presentation and the content of my presentation, and the idea here is to fundamentally give you an update on what I started about 2.5 years ago as a research project to understand vulnerabilities in the real world. And this project has been first time presented last year at Black, and I'm just curious, who was here last year at the presentation? So just a few. So you probably will see some of the differences. One of my goals today is to give you an update on what has changed since last year in the vulnerability space, in the real world, and then also I wanted to focus on specifically on internal vulnerabilities as a new subject matter. So let me give you a little bit of an idea here of the agenda that I have in mind here. First, talking about the methodology being used for this research. What was the substance and the core, how this data was gathered, where it came from, and how it was evaluated. Secondly, to talk about what has changed in the data from an external perspective in the past year. Last year, I was very much focused on presenting the state of the data from a vulnerability perspective on an externally facing view, perimeter facing view, fundamentally. This year, I'm going to give an update on the external view, but as said before, focusing on new data from an internal perspective. Summarizing up and give some recommendations and actions, what we can do in order to take responsibility and action in some of the data points that will come out here. So let's take a look on what is this research all about? What is the intention of this project that started about 2.5 years ago at the beginning of 2002. The idea here was to understand more in detail about vulnerabilities in the real world and how long are they lasting? How long does it take people to patch those vulnerabilities in the real world? We in the security industry have a lot of data about attacks, and we hear every single day about where the attacks are coming from, how many systems were attacked. And you may ask yourself sometimes, where does this data come from? On the other hand, we don't have a lot of analytical data about where vulnerabilities are in the real world, which vulnerabilities are out there, which are most prevalent, and which ones are actually being attacked and being targeted by different automated or even manual attacks there. So again, started about 2.5 years ago as a very small research project to get started in gathering vulnerability data in the real world on the internet. This was the first phase of the project. And so the sources of the data was gathered through our automated web service, where people coming in do vulnerability assessments on their devices. So the gathering and the constitution of the data, it's about 70% of the data that's presented here comes from global enterprise networks. Global means literally global, all over the world, between any countries that you just can imagine. 30% of the data comes from random trials, so people who randomly come to our website or other places which are referring back to our website then, and where they did an assessment of their own individual device. Keep in mind, I did not go out and scan devices on the internet, to be very clear here. Don't make this assumption at all. This was all driven by the individual people and users who did that. And very important as well, I wanted to emphasize on that, the data that I have available for this analysis and the raw data, particularly does not allow to attach it to a particular user or to a particular IP address. It's all anonymous data, but statistically, obviously, extremely relevant from a data perspective. Let's take a look a little bit on how this data evolved over time, over the past 2.5 years, starting out in the January of 2002 to where we are now. You see here on this graph pretty much the split between internally and externally facing systems. So the blue part of the curve here would be the scan results, the scan data from devices that are externally facing, web servers, mail server, anything that has a footprint on the internet. The red part on the other side are internally facing devices that are typically protected by a firewall internally companies, organizations. And you may ask the question here, so, well, obviously, over the past year, a lot of internal scanning was going on. Yes, that's correct, because that's where I started gathering internal data. When I presented last year, it was only external data focused on. You see here the spikes here. But you see also, interestingly enough, some spikes here. And again, it's not me triggered those scans. Instead, it's the community, people like yourself, systems administrators from companies who did those scans. And you may wonder what those peaks are. Anybody has any ideas? Go ahead, please.
I can't quite see the number 0, so those billions?
No, it's millions. So the top here is 1.2 million per month. So this is the data per month on a monthly basis. And on the bottom, you see. I'm sorry, you can't see that probably very well. Actually, you see from January 02 to pretty much now. The last data point is from end of June, so basically 3 weeks ago. But you see here, interestingly enough, some spikes that happened in the scanning activity. Anybody has any idea what that may be? Yeah, it's pretty much the two big worm outbreaks that we have been tracking, obviously. As soon as those worms were circulating, Blaster and Sasser, you saw immediately people obviously jumping on the bandwagon and starting aggressively scanning their network. So that's why we have some of the peaks. Keep in mind, all the data that I'm going to show you in a minute here is all normalized against this growth there. So there is no artifacts here from that perspective. Let's take a look a little bit at the raw data, at the raw numbers. So a total of 6.5 million scans of data is available for this analysis. And while the scanner and the scan engine was looking for close to 3,400, or exactly to be precise, 3,374 unique vulnerabilities. Not all of them you will see out there, but you will see out there that more than 2,000 vulnerabilities, unique vulnerabilities, are being found in the real world. So we know here it's obviously not just a Microsoft problem that we are dealing here with. Instead, it's a much more bigger issue of different vulnerabilities. Obviously, not all of those vulnerabilities are critical. Some of them are less important than other ones as well. And that's why I'm breaking it down here on the next part of the slide here into critical vulnerabilities. And what I mean by critical vulnerabilities, I mean vulnerabilities that would allow an attacker to compromise the system for either confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the information system. So out of those 6.5 million scans, you see that there was about 3.8 million critical vulnerabilities found. And obviously, statistically seen, that sounds like a lot of critical vulnerabilities. But if you break it out and think about the fact, and I can tell you some systems on the internet have more than 10, 15 critical vulnerabilities at the same time, you obviously see this a little bit more relative here. And then out of the 1,500 critical vulnerabilities that I was probing, about 1,000 of them unique are really existing in the real world. It's pretty interesting to see that actually happening, that you see so many different vulnerabilities still existing out there. Go ahead.
Your scanning technique, you can't really tell if somebody's scanning your own system multiple times.
Yes, that's correct.
You can analyze it.
There is repeat scans involved there, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
I have one other question. Confidence of particular scans varies dramatically, and I'm wondering, have you attempted at all to look at how the false positive, false negative rate of the different tests and use that to analyze?
Absolutely, very good question. So the question was around the fact how trustful are those individual probes and tests for. And for this specific analysis and for the presentation, I picked specifically only signatures that I know that have an active test involved. That means they are 100% precise from a testing perspective. So I skipped out all the tests that do not have 100% preciseness from a testing perspective. But yes, you're absolutely right. If you would consider everything, you would have some, obviously, artifacts involved here.
Another question. You're writing on the small print part, leakage of highly sensitive information.
Passwords typically.
But how would you detect that if you're using complete statistical data?
Well, if you probe a system on the internet or even internally for vulnerabilities, then you have classes of vulnerabilities that provide you different types of access to the system. So some vulnerability give you complete root access, for example, where you can read and write data. Some other vulnerability may give you read-only access to the system where you can read confidential data. So that's kind of the classification used for that. So for looking at the data then, obviously there is a lot of data now that we have available as raw data that we can look at specifically. Obviously some of the interesting data points that we all wanted to know about is what is actually the window of exposure that companies are exposed for today from a time frame that it takes them to patch their systems. And that related to obviously how long do vulnerabilities live on the internet. Are vulnerabilities like the Code Red vulnerability that was known and very famous about 2.5 years ago, are they eliminated from the internet now, or are they still out there and existing and creating worms to be continuously cycling? How long does it take companies to patch their systems? That was one of the fundamental questions that I was trying to get answers for here. And then obviously trending this over time, obviously that the data now is available for the past 2.5 years. You can see some very interesting trends on do people get faster or do they slow down on the patching process and patching cycle at all? The prevalence, what are some of the most prevalent vulnerabilities out there? Because that obviously has an immediate impact to where we will see some of the next worms to be happening. And for those of you who were here last year, who probably remember this slide, this was one slide that I presented last year. It was the, at this point, very recent released WebDAV vulnerability. And what you see here on this slide from the point of release in March in 2003 up to the conference last year on how the community responded to patching this vulnerability. You see the number of vulnerable systems on the vertical axis here, and you see in the pink color as the time progresses, the number of systems as they were patched, and the dotted line is just an approximation here. And so what I derived here from that last year is what I defined the half-life of vulnerabilities, very similar to radioactive decay, where you have every period, you're eliminating 50% of your contenders of your vulnerabilities on the internet. And that was pretty interesting to see actually at the same time last year, the half-life of critical vulnerabilities was about 30 days, that it took organizations to patch 50% of the vulnerable systems after the announcement of a patch or the vulnerability or both when they were available. And that was pretty interesting to see that actually, and looking at this curve from before here, at this one here, it's interesting to see how it actually continued and progressed after the fact. So let me show you what happened after Black Hat last year. So that's the continuation of this patching process. You would see here the first third of the curve is pretty much what was presented last year, and you see here pretty much the continuation of the patching cycle after the Black Hat conference here in the same way. So it was very clear here that this half-life is pretty true and pretty accurate actually in a way. And when you look at many vulnerabilities, WebDAV is just one example of a vulnerabilities. If you look at many different ones, you see exactly the same pattern of behavior here. And you can look at many other ones. This is another one that's quite popular and quite known out there, affecting WFTP. And you see the same pattern of behavior over the past 2 years as people putting the patches on their system. So initially, when the announcements came, patches were put on there. Interestingly enough, now looking more closer and more recent into the more recent data, this is a vulnerability, and I'm sorry you probably can't see the color line, probably not very well here from the back. You see here the ASN1 vulnerability, which was announced in February 2004 this year, just a few months ago here. And interestingly enough, you see the same patching behavior of half-life. And you can draw other examples as well. This is the SASA vulnerability, the LSAS vulnerability that led to the SASA worm. You see the same behavior.
Sorry, I've got a really stupid question. How can the stats actually go up?
Sorry, what is that?
How can the stats go up over time? Why are you getting these spikes?
Yeah, I will have a specific part to that, so I would like to defer this for the moment. I will come back to that subject very specifically, talking about some of the bumps and why it's going up there. And interestingly enough, if you look at the data of more recent released vulnerabilities, you will see that we made significant progress in eliminating, or not eliminating, but shortening the half-life of those vulnerabilities. And what I can update now is basically, as of now, we have been able to reduce this half-life to 21 days, which is pretty significant looking at the fact. And if you remember, for all of you who were here last year, I put the challenge out to basically bring back the half-life to 15 to 20 days. So I'm pretty enthusiastic and pretty happy to say now that we have been able to bring it back to 21 days. And obviously it's all part of its big part is awareness out there that helped companies to bring back the patching cycle and get the patches out faster to their systems, and therefore obviously eliminating a big part of the window of exposure. And you can do this analysis with many other vulnerabilities. You will see now that we are pretty much down at 21 days. So I'm wondering actually where the physical limits are here, where we can go, where we can take this down this patching cycle to less than 21 days. So let's take a look now on this was again very much focused on externally facing systems, perimeter facing systems, devices that are exposed to the internet. Let's take a look now inside companies' networks. And this is an example of a vulnerability that was highly prevalent internally. And I think there's another one that I brought here, which is another example of a vulnerability that was highly prevalent internally. You see here from the announcement, which was pretty much at the end of last year, close at the end of last year, you see the patching behavior. And you see here, just from the look and feel here, you see that obviously the patching was by far not as aggressive as it was on the externally facing systems. And that's unfortunately one of the bad news here today, that we are talking today about a half-life of vulnerabilities internally of about 62 days. So in comparison to the improvements we made externally from 30 days to 21 days in 1 year, we still have a lot of room for improvements and a lot of work to do on the internal networks. And you see here obviously on this diagram here what kind of difference that makes from an exposure perspective, from a window of exposure perspective for companies, to have obviously externally a great half-life, but internally have a significant exposure to their networks of 62 days. Does this make sense? So let me take you now back to the question that you asked before. What is some of the things going on? Why are some of the things a little bit bumpy here and there? And interestingly, if you look at all these data points, you will see that the majority of vulnerabilities follows exactly the half-life rules, where you have like every period you're eliminating another 50% of the tag here. But interestingly enough, if you look at some vulnerabilities, you see a completely erratic behavior here. And this is an example here of a typical configuration issue of SSL servers out being on the internet that allow clear text negotiation. Another example is the vulnerability that led to the SASA worm, which you see here, behavior that's rather interesting. You see obviously patching very quickly as soon as the worm was hitting. Before, nobody patched, as we all know, before the worm really hit there. But as soon as the worm hit, people starting putting patches on there, and then suddenly vulnerabilities are coming back and being patched again and coming back there. And I'm still gathering data what some of the reasoning behind that is, what could be the reasoning behind it. I talked to a lot of people actually in the industry, what some of the reasoning behind is. And one of the explanations that some organizations gave me on what their thoughts are about that is the fact that lots of organizations today are still using predefined images to roll out new servers. So basically they build once a year an image that's great and wonderful that they create for their rollout of new servers. But if you don't keep those images updated, what you basically do is you create new servers with old flaws built in there. That's one of the explanations that I got from enterprises and administrators, and to me it makes just a lot of sense there. So that's why you see some of the cycles of reoccurring vulnerabilities. Please.
Also, Microsoft packages what's called MSDE, Microsoft SQL Desktop Edition, with a lot of their products, and it comes basically with a standard stock SQL server runs like the MS SQL Server 80, not patched at all. That's actually what a lot of Slammer got hit with, which is just people don't even know what's on their server.
Very good point, exactly. The fact that MSD, or the component in this case that was affected, was distributed with so many other products that probably was not even patching going on there. That's why you see some of the erratic behavior. And as I said, it's interestingly enough, it's a very small number actually of vulnerabilities that show this erratic behavior. The majority of them very nicely and very as anticipated and as expected follow the half-life rules there. Obviously what that means here really in this context is that obviously as soon as you have new vulnerabilities reoccurring and repopping up, what you have is obviously you continuously create new food for worms that are popping up there in the same way. And that's one of the next slide that I was tracking here. So this is the number of infected systems being found. I'm not tracking worm instances circulating, to be precise here. I'm tracking instances of computers and systems that are being infected or are infected by those respective worms. And I'm sorry, you probably may not be able to read it as well here. So the yellow line here is, for example, another derivative that just came up on the blaster worm. It's a year later pretty much now where you see those reinfections occur, and the pink line that kind of wanders down a little bit here is the number of code red infections. A worm that is out there probably 2.5 years, 3 years now, and you still see continuous number of infections as some of those servers are popping up with vulnerabilities being in there. And I see this, obviously what's happening here is we continuously add noise to the internet here, to the layer of internet, where there's a continuous cycle of those worms happening that are continuously to add to this noise on the internet. And that's what I was basically talking about here in one of those conclusions as well, is that some of the vulnerabilities and worms will not go away, unfortunately, as we initially thought about the fact, well, after some patching and patching and patching, at some point in time we will be able to declare a vulnerability for gone or dead, or whatever term you want to use here. But that's unfortunately not the case. So the reality is we will see some of those worms and vulnerabilities popping up again and again and again. Taking a look now on the correlation between a vulnerability being announced and the worms are circulating. It's pretty interesting to see, obviously, and you've probably read a lot in the press about it, how the cycle is shrinking, how the worms are becoming faster and faster. And this is the example of the SASA worm, where you see in blue the vulnerability or the number of instances of vulnerable systems. And the scale for this one is on the right side, so you see it's about 60,000 at the top. And then on the left side, you see the number of infections or infected systems following right after that path. And what that really means, obviously, is as the worms are circulating faster and faster, we will see those worms hitting pretty much the first two half-life of vulnerabilities within that time frame. So the first two half-lives are really the most critical time where we obviously need to look at, because that's where obviously those worms have the biggest breeding ground there. And when you do the analysis and the numbers, you see that about 80% of worms and automated attacks are pretty much hitting within those first two half-life periods of critical vulnerabilities. Let's take a look now a little bit differently into the same data. What you see here is a mapping on the horizontal of unique and different vulnerabilities. You remember I talked about 2,000 different vulnerabilities that I found on the internet out. And you see here the mapping of those 2,000 different vulnerabilities, and on the vertical you see the number of instances, or the instances of vulnerable systems. And the numbers here are about 700,000, close to 1 million. And what you see here, interestingly enough, obviously, is there is a big top 10 or top 15 list, as I call them, that are standing out there. And obviously, if you look at this objectively, what we see here in this prevalence graph is fundamentally the fact that if I'm a worm writer, I'm not going to target one of those very low profile vulnerabilities that are at the bottom end. I'm going to target one of those vulnerabilities, obviously, that have a high prevalency, because that's where I reach the biggest exposure and the biggest impact, obviously. And the interesting thing is, if you look at this top 10 list or top 15 list over time, it's not a static list as we anticipate, obviously, because new high-profile vulnerabilities becoming known, other ones are being patched there. So there is a continuous change and a continuous trend. And I looked into this data as well in 6-month periods over the past 2.5 years. And you can see here that there is obviously a continuous shift of this top 10, top 15 list going on, which obviously leads me to the conclusion that about 50% of those most prevalent vulnerabilities are being replaced by new ones during the course of the year. So that's pretty much the top 10 list that's kind of dynamically moving during the course of the year. And what I mean here by most prevalent and critical, it's obviously those ones that you saw in the graph here as standing out there as the top 10 and top 15. And that really has started me thinking about what can we do to help, obviously, get an understanding in the community. What are those top 10? Because the bad guys know them, obviously. But what can we do in the community to help understanding what are those top 10? So we have started publishing as a service to the community on a regular basis, pretty much on a weekly basis, updated this top 10 list of what are the top 10 most prevalent vulnerabilities. And I'm breaking them out by external and internal vulnerabilities, because you will see there is a significant difference because of the threat profiles are very different internally and externally. And this is, as of today, in real time, the list of the top most prevalent and most critical vulnerabilities on the internet that are out there. And you will see here some interesting candidates. You'll see Apache on there as of today, interestingly enough. Pretty old one, actually. You see, obviously, lots of Microsoft technologies out there. You see SendMail. Interestingly enough, you still see a candidate that was on last year, writable SNMP. There's many, many devices on the internet, I can tell you, where you can write into SNMP. It's pretty interesting to see that, actually. Typical configuration error that typically is not caught with the real eye if you don't focus on that specifically, because everybody's so focused on putting patches out, but very often configuration issues are then not considered strong enough. And if you look at the same data internally, you see a similar list here with just different vulnerabilities on there, obviously. The threat profile is differently, and the types of technologies that we're using internally is different as well. So you see here on the internal list here, technologies like Internet Explorer, very big deal. By the way, those lists are not sorted by, within themselves, within the top 10, they're not sorted by number of vulnerable systems, they are sorted by CVE numbers, just to clarify that. Even the list before, the external list, was not sorted by prevalence or by number of systems. It was purely sorted by CVE lists here. And interestingly enough, you see also still lots of RPC-based issues out there. The 3 big RPC vulnerabilities are still on the list here internally as one of the biggest security issues internally. You see Microsoft SQL, weak databases, the SASA issue. It's still a big deal out there on internal networks. And it's one of the top 10 contenders here. Obviously, as we continue to publish this list, I think it's going to help the community and be one of the steps, hopefully, that we can do to eliminate further the window of exposure internally as well as externally. So let me summarize now briefly the 4 laws of vulnerabilities as I have updated them this year. The first aspect, talking about the half-life of a vulnerability. As I mentioned before, today it's about 21 days on externally facing systems. It's about 62 days on internally facing systems. And this considers only critical vulnerabilities. Obviously, for less important vulnerabilities and less critical vulnerabilities, the situation obviously looks very different. The aspect of prevalence, you remember the fact that those top 10 or top 15 are moving target, and 50% of those most prevalent and critical vulnerabilities are being replaced by new ones during the course of the year. That's why we have started publishing the top 10 list to help the community patch those problems. The third aspect of persistence, the fact that vulnerabilities or some vulnerabilities will not go away anytime soon. And lastly, the aspect of exploitation, where about 80%, that's today, 80% of automated exploits and worms are targeting the first two half-life of critical vulnerabilities. And that's pretty much summarizing up the laws of vulnerabilities. So there would be no presentation with a challenge that I wanted to put out there. And you remember I put out the challenge last year on the bringing back the half-life on external vulnerabilities. And I think this year it's time about to look at how can we reduce the half-life of internal vulnerabilities? How can we eliminate the 60-day half-life, which is obviously a significant window of exposure? And I'm suggesting to bring back this half-life of 60 days, bring it back to 40 days on internal networks. You think this is realistic? Please.
Do you have a breakdown of the number of machines that we're talking about in terms of percentage of a whole? So say you've got your internal plus your external, some of those, what percentage is internal versus external?
I will go back to the very, very early slide. You can see it's probably, I would say, nowadays, because the internal picked up significantly, I think the internal data is probably twice as much as the external data when you take a spot check at the moment.
In terms of numbers of boxes at the moment?
Correct, correct.
A lot of internal systems will be affected too. You have your images, but a lot of organizations also have patch servers, so if their image is there, they had the latest patches there that it can be done right away.
Absolutely,
So
absolutely.
3 years down the line.
True.
Do you have this data cross-reference to size of organization? So that, is it a medium-tier business issue, or is it a Fortune 500 issue?
No, no. I have no way to attach this data to either an IP address, to a user, or even to an organization. It's just purely statistical data. So I would obviously, I think it would be great to make some analysis on either geographies and those kind of things, but unfortunately the data that I have available and that is available to us and to me does not provide any of that details.
Does the existence of a worm affect the half-life vulnerability?
I think it does it indirectly, because what it does, it basically, obviously, as we saw on the number of scans that were triggered, it immediately triggered a frenzy of scanning, and therefore it obviously triggered a significant uptake on the number of scans and therefore the action. So I think there is an indirect response to a worm, but I don't think there is a direct response. And by the way, I believe a big part of why we have been able to reduce the half-life from 30 days to 21 days is exactly in the fact that we saw some high-profile worms last year that obviously created tremendous awareness. I think personally, in order to accomplish that goal here, to reduce the half-life to 40 days, I think there is 3 things that need to happen. The first is, I think, awareness. I think the awareness needs to happen, that people need to be aware about data like that, or the issue that we have a significant window of exposure internally. The second is people need to be able to prioritize vulnerabilities. There is no way that you can fix every single vulnerability. It's completely unrealistic. You have to focus on what's most important. And you have to focus on what's most important in your context, in your business context, in your environment context, because you may not run this type of technology that's highly prevalent there. So that's a very important part as well, the ability that you can identify on your environment what's most critical to you. And the third aspect I think that we need to look into is the level of automation that companies need to rely on to accomplish that goal. The time is over where you have done once a year or twice a year, manually looked at your networks for security holes and did some patching here and there. There has to be an automated process that supports and facilitates that capability. And I think if we do those 3 steps, the awareness, the prioritization, and the automation, then I think we will be very, very able to bring back this half-life back to 40 days, which hopefully is what I'm going to be talking about next year at the conference here, to give an update on this data and talking about the radical improvement that we made over 2004 internally. Please.
Have you gotten any data points? I noticed a lot of these things are dealing with products that have not had a new major version released. Have you seen any data points on like how a new major version that would already have to fix for something rolled into it, and how that is one of the
Very good question, actually. No, I haven't looked into this, but it's a good aspect to actually analyze that for that as well, to do some correlation between what would be like an older technology with patches versus a radically new technology. Good point. I haven't done that analysis, but would be a good suggestion to look at it in the future.
SQL Server hasn't come out with anything new this year, but they'll be coming up with something soon.
Right.
They would supposedly already be slam free.
Right. No, good point. Hopefully. Please.
Along the same lines, correlation data around service packs would be really interesting because I know a lot of people don't stay on their patches, but they do stay on their service packs.
Sure.
And if there's always a big drop around those too, I mean, it would kind of be interesting to see if maybe the discipline is more on our side because we're not staying on the patches. We're just choosing to, rather than make a lot of little effort throughout the time period, it's more we like to do big gargantuan efforts, twice a year or once every 3 months or whatever.
Sure. I was mostly focused on individual vulnerabilities that had some high-profile impact on the industry, but I think it's a valuable point as well to look specifically from a service pack perspective. So I think in summarizing up some of the actions we can take, obviously the very good news here is we made significant progress on the external side, and that's fantastic news. I think that we have been able to reduce that from 30 days to 21 days. Obviously, we have a goal in front of us here, and we need all your support as well to do that. I think you obviously are going to play a big role in that, making that happen by not only sharing this information, by talking about the issues, creating awareness, but also in your respective roles, organizations you have, to take a specific look. And I've put some references out here just for those guys who within you are interested in looking more into this in detail or study this more, and also put my contact information out here. So just in case you wanted to follow up with that or have some additional questions. I'm always looking for feedback from the community here, what you think about that, what you think about that research, about these data points, and what we can do differently and better as well. Please.
I have a question. Does this data somehow account for local client systems or internal vulnerabilities, remote users? Let's say somebody takes a lot of data because of the field, and a lot of times, I think most major corporations don't patch remote machines simply because they don't have access to the full time VPN elsewhere.
Yeah. So to answer your question, the question was related to how does this data points consider the aspects of like a moving user that's somewhere out on the internet versus on the internal network. So from a methodology perspective, the scanning separates between devices that were at the moment when they were scanned internally at the firewall and when they were externally to the company's firewall. So there could be a situation where one device is in both sets here included as well.
Is there any overlap between your top 10 list and the SANS top 20?
There is actually, I'm a member of the SANS 20 working group, so there is obviously a big overlap there, and I'm providing this obviously to the SANS 20 working group as well. There is, the SANS 20 is more grouped by categories of vulnerabilities. This is more specifically targeted to individual specific high-profile vulnerabilities. The SANS 20 is more a collection of groups of vulnerabilities, and one of the groups that's in the SANS 20 is, for example, Internet Information Server. Another group is Internet Explorer. So there is a high degree of overlap, obviously, and I would call this top 10 a subset of what the SANS 20 is, with a more focused on specifically what's hot today because it may change tomorrow. It's more a real-time dynamic index that's being updated.
I understand correctly, this is a self-selecting sample set. And if we assume that the people who scan their systems proactively are more interested in security than average, do you think your data would imply that the internet is actually more dangerous? Or do you think your data implies that the internet is safer than average?
Yeah, very good question. The question was related to the fact, as this is a self-selecting sample of results and data, do I believe is the real world actually worse than what we're talking about here? And my opinion is absolutely. I think what we obviously have here, we have some not statistical errors, but errors in a sense that the results that we see here are probably beautified by the fact that those people who do the scanning already probably are already over the awareness level. So I think that there is probably some other data out there that would be interesting to look at that probably looks very different in a sense for those organizations who don't even have the awareness yet.
You had a worm that clobbered a host, and the host went down, wouldn't that tend to drive the half-life of respectable systems down very rapidly?
If I have, sorry.
You have the ultimately lethal worm.
Yeah.
It spreads over the entire internet in 3 seconds and kills every host.
Good,
Half-life.
good question. Yeah. So the question was related to the fact: how about if there is worms out that kill systems? How does this play into the statistics here? So the numbers that I was talking about here and all the data only affects systems that are available and running during the test of the scan being performed. So even if there is a worm out there that would knock down systems, that would obviously not be impacting the data at all.
Gerhard, a large quantity of spam today is coming out of compromised or hijacked hosts. What can we extrapolate from your research over on the trend about hijacked hosts?
Well, I think the interesting view to do here would be to correlate vulnerability data with the specific spamming exploits that are being circulated out there. And I haven't done that, but I think it would be an interesting exercise as well to look into correlate that. And we have signatures. We test for compromised those targets for the spamming. There are specific web servers out there that are like gatherings. I don't know what they're called, gatherers or whatever, for those spamming data. And we can scan and we identify them. And yes, we find them out there, but I haven't done any correlation related to it.
How can you tell the difference in your data between the number of hosts that have been scanned versus those that are vulnerable? In other words, how do you know that that the vulnerabilities is trending down? It's just not the number of people scanning their systems that's trending down.
Well, because I obviously know how many scans that are being performed, so I know the exact number, how many scans are being performed there, and then I also know how many systems that are responding within this number of scans there. So, and then I normalize the data based on the variations of scans there to have to eliminate the change in trend there.
You talk about prioritization of what patches to apply to what systems or what vulnerabilities. Would you expand on that?
Sure. I think that's probably one of my personal biggest focus points to help people to help prioritize what's most critical for their environment. And I think people have to take a layered approach. Just thinking about the fact you're just starting scanning your network and you're patching everything is totally unrealistic. So what you have to take steps, you have to define for yourself what are some of the milestones that you want to take. And I usually recommend people using like the top 10 here or the SANS 20 or some other top X list that people have come up with, the community came up or enterprises came up with, and put milestones behind and then measure your network specifically against those top 10 lists and measure the networks that you have against those top lists in the context of the business priority. Because the fact that you may be vulnerable may not be necessarily indicate that you may need to fix the systems. You may want to correlate that together with the fact how important are the systems to you as an organization. Your enterprise business application may be more important to you than your workstation of somebody in a remote office there. So I think it's important that you correlate this data together with the business priorities that you have in the organization. So it's the metrics of data, raw data from pure vulnerabilities, that's what I present here. And then there is the input coming from the business side. What are some of the most critical business applications that you have in your organization? And if you correlate that, you will see very quickly where do you need to start the patching process and where do you have longer time to start putting the patches on there. Please.
Well, obviously, you're only looking at attacks from the network, not like local elevation privilege attacks. So, when it comes to patching, there's another way I believe of looking at things. If you have a remote attack that can execute arbitrary commands, that's a lot more important than an attack that can like divulge your cookies. You know, and that's another way of looking at it. Which do you patch first?
That's what I meant by the severity of individual vulnerabilities. So you have obviously on the one side, if you say on the vertical, you have the business priorities. On the horizontal, you have the business priority. On the vertical, you have the severities of individual vulnerabilities. Because as you rightfully said, if this is a vulnerabilities that allows you to exploit code on the machine, well, you obviously have you have to run faster than if it's a vulnerability that is just a nuisance but doesn't really create a big danger to your company. And only the correlation of those two parameters really gets you to the level of where you need to start the patching process.
Just as a comment, everybody has a white book and their packs, the NSA, IAM, evaluation methodology. It helps you do exactly that, tie business priorities to the vulnerabilities that are out there. It's very clear type of process.
Okay, great. So this is part of the bags here that everybody got here. Okay, so there's supposedly a book in the bags that comes from, who is the author?
The NSA wrote the process, and I don't know the author.
Okay, anyway, the book is in your bags. Any other questions? Anything? What's your general thought, your general response? I'm just very curious on seeing what you think about it and what we can do, also some ideas what we can do next. Hopefully we have some continued dialogue on this subject here. Please.
I have to agree. It's great that the half-life went down, and it really sucks big time that on internal networks it is so much larger. It just doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. Well, I think personally, my reasoning behind this, I think that some of the challenges that companies are facing today is just the fact that you have externally maybe 50 systems to patch, but internally you may have 50,000 systems to patch. And I think that's part of the issue why people are very focused and very attached to the perimeter devices and external devices and DMC devices. But then when it comes to internal devices, there is obviously challenges there.
And I think related to that is the issue that you mentioned where they have a master hard drive and just clone it, and it's not patched.
Sure,
That
sure.
hard drive is patched.
Sure.
It's a big feature.
Absolutely, it's the replication factor that you get here.
I think a large factor you find too is resources. Because I know as an SA and also trying to do security, unfortunately you don't always have the money or the time to set up the infrastructure.
Sure. That's what it comes down to. That's why I think that a big part is the level of automation that can happen and that needs to happen in this space is just, we're just at the very early level here, I think. Either one.
To add to that, I think that a lot of the vendors, the software companies, Microsoft and the various flavors of INX out there don't really do a good enough job advertising mitigation, ways to mitigate rather than just all out. Patching is hard. Patching typically requires a reboot, requires some kind of automated process to do in scale. It's not the easiest task in the world. So I think, but at the same time, applying a reg key via a AD policy change that would actually stop the exploit completely in its tracks.
Sure.
And I don't think the vendors do nearly enough advertising or evangelism around that.
Mm-hmm.
Around just instead of trying to, the answer being block it, the answer is do this, buy yourself 3 months, and then patch it.
Agreed.
So a comment on that. I think part of the reason that internal vulnerabilities aren't patched as easily is partially because the number of machines built into an internal network, but it's also the fact that you want to make sure that you don't break any existing applications that the corporate network uses. Because if you have a CEO that comes down to you one day after you patch and says, I can't use this, and I can't do a meeting or whatever, then that's also a business interruption issue.
Yeah. I've heard that's a good point actually. The question was related, or the comment was related to the fact that do you have to do testing on the patches before you roll them out, and what's the effort to go through the testing? And I have heard very different opinions. From one opinion on the very far extreme saying, I'm going to go through a very extensive bake-off with every patch that I'm going to put on there, to the other extreme, the day the patch comes out, it's going to be rolled out to my workstations, and I'm only doing testing for servers. So I've heard both extremes of the planet here. Please.
Follow up on the speaker in the front row's point. I think patching needs to be part of a holistic system that looks at other things other than patching. And we talked a little bit about remediation, like doing a reg hack or something like that. But how about if you have a vulnerability that affects the food service, figure out if you need the damn food service and shut it off.
Sure.
And then take that a step further. And why are you running food service in the first place if you don't
that is required. Yeah, yeah,
And my answer is going to be different than yours and yours.
yeah. It's just I think.
Screw it down to the point where it breaks and then back it off a little tiny bit, you've got a lot less risk than
Yeah, I think you make a true point here. That the fact that the idea obviously is to eliminate unnecessary services that are not necessary for the operation. But it starts, I think, at the problem that we really don't know exactly what do we need to run like a network on a corporate level. To run Windows, I would have a really hard time to tell you now exactly what you need there to run every single service that you in your environment have to run, because even user application level applications use some services and ports you have no idea about. They may not be even documented. So I think shutting down is kind of a trial and error exercise that you may have to go through, but it can be very painful as well. But I agree, it's a good. Yeah, exactly.
How would you possibly do that with some sort of system for automating
Yeah.
scale across 50,000 nodes?
Exactly.
You could figure it out. You need someone deploying.
I know many companies that have policies or procedures in place where they say, well, in my environment, I'm not tolerating VNC. But how do you enforce that? That's I think, a big part of the question. You have to regularly and methodically, obviously, audit and assess your network. And again, as I said before, the time where you do 1 or 2 audits a year is obviously history. You have to do this obviously much more frequently and much more regularly to keep up with the changing infrastructure that we are dealing with here. Please.
With the window from discovery of a vulnerability to actually having an exploit getting smaller, would we naturally expect to see your half-lives coming down?
That's what I hope. I mean, this is the first year I have internal data, so that's a spot check of this past year with 62 days, because last year, I just started last year gathering internal data, so hopefully next year, with the continuous evolution of worms and those kind of threats, we'll probably see some downtime by nature, but hopefully a big part of it comes as well by the fact of awareness that we all can create here, and that we can help the community to emphasize on how important it is to bring back the half-life of internal vulnerability.
Something I've seen maybe hovering underneath the surface is the fact that some people may be reflecting people that are complacent, doing nothing. Now, actually, I know your statistics are self-reported, so that's affect that. But somebody that's complacent does nothing until they're actually under the gun. You're going to see that number starting to drop back too, because you're
Sure.
going to get more often.
Sure.
I have to agree with a little bit with the other speakers that when you start talking about internal systems, while ideally it would be desirable to patch, particularly unbounded systems which we have no control over, ultimately though, we have to look at policy reinforcement and remediation. Because, for example, even in a best system, let's say it requires 10 man-minutes per machine per month to do this. Okay, that's 2 man-hours. That's a 0.1% loss of availability. That, I mean, if you really brought that up to a CIO, that would be unacceptable. I mean, the only way you're going to get beyond that barrier is through remediation and policy enforcement, which is not wholesale patching.
Yeah, I mean, remediation in many ways. I did not necessarily imply when I was talking about patching. Patching to me is also registry key or some other means of eliminating the exposure. I'm not necessarily just always recommend and say, well, you have to put the patches on. Even in my data set, I have no way to figure out if this was patched through a registry key or through a firewall that's put in front that blocks support or through some other means. So I'm not necessarily implying, and I agree, I'm not implying that there's always has to be the patch is always the best solution.
No, I think my point is, though, that when you start looking to the interior versus perimeter systems,
Yeah.
which are kind of bound to their applications and such,
Sure.
we may need a different set of tools to bring that half-life down.
You mean to more automate the process, or? Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I would disagree. I think there's a lot of tools out there already. I've actually researched this. Nice example, San Diego Supercomputing Center, where they have about 400 Windows boxes, 370 Unix boxes, 5 different flavors, and they're patched all the time. And the deal is, if you're not patched, you don't get on their internal network.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? The big problem is getting
Yeah. Keep it up and running. I agree. Keep it up and running is much easier than going over the first hump to get to the level of where you need to be. Yeah, yeah. Because it means also in many ways it means getting rid of all the Windows 98 and Windows 95s and whatever crap we have out there that obviously is not, we're not going to be able to secure.
There is definitely an issue here. Maybe what you got to argue is if we don't do this, it's going to be more difficult than we have to meet the cost.
But I would say that one of your statements actually proves the point. You pointed out that by policy, they don't go through the hoops, they cannot access. So policy enforcement is a key component of what they're saying. That was my point.
What you said?
Well, I'm saying that policy enforcement and remediation, reduction of the overall threat are really the first steps. You patch after you have policy.
I don't think you guys talking different things. I think you're saying the same thing in different words. Very good. Any other questions? Well, if not, I thank you very much for... Yes, there is one more question. Thanks again. And if you have any other suggestions, just send me an email, let me know. I'm always curious.